Trevor Shaku is the spokesperson of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, Saftu, and he joins us now. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Shaku. Your thoughts and reaction to the budget that was presented by the Finance Minister?
We, as the South African Federation of Trade Unions, have already registered a number of differences and dissatisfaction with the budget delivered by the minister in relation, for instance, to the question of the budget cuts which are being carried onto public departments or departments of government, such as your policing, your courts and prisons, your health, and all of that. There is a continued austerity, that is budget cuts, which are being planned for the medium term, but also those which are being implemented as of this particular financial year. You will see there that in this current financial year, the health department is going to lose up to 245 million in budget cuts. The law, the courts and the prisons, which require this money very desperately, are going to also lose in the region of 300 millions. And you have also the Home Affairs, which is going to lose 288 millions. Now, these are critical departments which are responsible for delivering services. For instance, the courts and the prisons, we very much and desperately need them to be equipped, to be resourced, because there is a problem of the headcount reduction which took place over the years, and this affects the delivery or the ability and the capability of government to be able to deliver services in those particular categories of public service. Now, we are very much dissatisfied insofar as the budget is concerned, especially when it comes to the social services, the public departments responsible for the delivery of services.
You mentioned the word austerity, and the Finance Minister was quite specific, saying that this isn't an austerity budget. It's a budget that has to make some trade-offs between the interests of the country in the short term and the long term, the country's prosperity. He says that one has to make trade-offs in difficult times. Are we saying that Labour doesn't see this, or that he is not seeing your point of view?
He is not seeing it. In fact, the very statement that this budget was not an austerity budget was a contradiction of sort, because in the budget tabled by him, there are those cuts. We can see them. I've already counted some of those in Home Affairs, in terms of police, in terms of courts and prisons, in terms of health. These are nominal cuts in the upcoming financial year. And you see, even in the long term, in the medium term, that is from now until 2025-26, there's going to be declines in those budgets in real terms. Now, the minister does not recognize this. I don't understand why, because one would expect that he is the first person to know these things. And actually what he should have come up with is that these cuts are necessary. That's what he, of course, they are not necessary according to us. But what he should have said is that these cuts are necessary. But to say that there was no austerity, or this budget is not an austerity budget, is quite a lie. We look at the budget in two ways, at least, in the nominal terms and in the real terms. In the nominal terms, there are going to be cuts in the medium term. There are also going to be cuts in nominal terms for the upcoming financial year, 23-24. Now, there are also cuts in real terms, because except for economic development and community development, all those departments are going to actually receive declines, are going to experience declines in their budgets in the medium term, because they are well below inflation. But secondly, they are also not keeping up with the population growth, because what you have to do when you are dealing with public finance, you have to factor in the question of the inflation but also factor in the question of population growth. These are two important factors which have a serious bearing on the ability of the buying power of what you allocate to these departments to be able to deliver services adequately to the people.
Talking about budgeting for under-inflation expenditure, the wage bill, public sector, how are you going to close this gap? Unions are saying 10% minimum. The finance minister has put in the budget 3.3% over the next 3 years. How are you going to meet each other somewhere in between there? Or is 10% the cutoff and that's it?
Look, the demand for 10% is because of the rising cost of living. And we can't back down from that, especially in the context of a 2022-2023 financial year, which was marred by a rising cost of living in all categories, from fuel, transport, electricity, food, and even increases in other areas of expenditure which households ought to meet in order to ensure that they give a proper and adequate living condition for their families. This is the first point. Now, the gap, which is mostly used by the minister and his colleagues and some experts who are pro-neoliberal fiscal and monetary policy, is that they are trying to scare people by raising the figures around the so-called bloated public sector wage bill, but at the same time they do this by comparing it to other areas of expenditure, and then they will show you these figures which are very scary, and any common and ordinary human being, citizen in the country, would actually make sense of what they're saying, because usually how we approach public finance, which is very wrong by the way, but how we approach public finance is the manner in which we approach, or we make inference with how we manage our own household financial affairs. So you know, as a matter of fact, that certain area of expenditure should not overcrowd other areas of expenditure. And they bring this analogy, which stems from a household budget type of a mentality, and give it to the people. Of course, people will, to a certain extent, make sense of this. But that is the reason why some of us have to come to dispel the myths around this budgeting. Let me show you how this budget actually can be closed. The so-called huge gap of the public sector wage bill can be closed. So you have two ways through which you can do this. The first one is if you spend in areas of economy where you stimulate economic growth. And once you stimulate economic growth, because debt to GDP ratio is nothing but a quantitative comparison, it would shrink automatically. Once GDP starts growing, even at the rate where we are at the current moment, you will see the debt to GDP ratio starting to shrink. Now, how do you do this in terms of the public sector wage bill versus other areas of expenditure in government? You do this by ensuring that you increase other areas of expenditure. You increase areas of expenditure where this department will be able to expand their infrastructure. We've already seen that public institutions do not have adequate infrastructure. They have poor infrastructure. So infrastructure ought to be expanded. You also do this by ensuring that you allocate as much possible so that these departments can be able to spend on equipment and machinery. And all of this, as soon as they start growing, they will diminish the gap which now exists between the public sector wage bill and other areas of public expenditure. So these are merely quantitative comparisons which have no bearing whatsoever on the ability of government to spend.
All right. So I know you represent unions, but for those that are not employed, the social grants is good news, I guess. But I suppose what most people were looking and hoping for is more direction towards the basic income grant.
Indeed. As the South African Federation of Trade Unions, actually, we were looking forward to that. We, together with allies we are working with in the working class movement, your Cry of Excluded, Assembly of the Unemployed, Botshabelo Unemployed Movement, and many other scores of organizations we are working with. We have actually put forward this demand in previous years, in 2021, that we demand a basic income grant to be introduced at 1,500 for the unemployed. And the minister did not, of course, make concessions to this. And by the way, we think the basic income grant, including what we call the jobs guarantee, because this is one demand which goes in tandem with the basic income grant demand. We are saying that the minister has to do this, and these two important demands are going to actually stimulate the growth of the South African economy. At the current moment, you are sitting with an economy whereby the reasons for some of the liquidations, according to Statistics South Africa, is because of the diminishing demand, which it has put it at 10%. You also have an idling industrial capacity, but you have schools which increasingly are becoming dangerous for both learners and teachers and require security. And most of the public schools in South Africa, especially those quintile 1 to 3 schools, do not have security at all. So this you can do by introducing, so you can create these jobs as part of introducing the jobs guarantee scheme, so that the 12 and more than 12 million people in the country who cannot find employment at the current moment would be able to be employed there. But those who cannot find those jobs will be able to be cushioned by the basic income grant of 1,500. It's still a little bit minuscule, but it is better than nothing, especially in the context of the rising cost of living. If you look at the household affordability index, which shows the skyrocketing prices of grocery. So in that context, you could be able to alleviate the problems of pauperism, which our people have been sentenced to by unemployment, rising unemployment. So we indeed, in that category, were very much disappointed with the minister's speech.
Okay, Mr. Shaku, we'll leave it there for today, but we'll see what happens in the coming days once you mobilize your thoughts and perhaps your forces on this wage disparity. Thanks so much indeed for your time.